Why don't we first start? How did you end up? Let's talk about where you grew up and your upbringing.
Okay. Uh, I was born in Clairton, Pennsylvania, July 18, 1928. Clairton is a third class city with a population between 19 and 25,000. It's located about 14 miles southwest of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's located on the Monongahela River, and it had a steel mill, a small chemical plant, and those two industries provided a tax base for them to have really nice high school. The high school which I attended was built in 1927, so it was rather modern, indoor swimming pool and everything. The population growing up, I lived in a community which was highly ethnic. Uh, for example, the next door neighbors were the Fuscos from Italy, and across the street were the Calametis from Sicily, and one house over were the Kadars from Hungary, and then across the street were a family from one of the Slavic countries, and then there were the another family in the neighborhood who was from Russia. So the population, in fact, the area was so ethnically dominated with blacks and people coming from Europe, they called it Hunky Town. And so there were no problems. The neighbors got along very well. The Some of the local merchants, there were the Rex who were they were Jewish. Then the Shaheens were from Lebanon. They ran a small confectionery. So it was a rather quiet, amiable type of neighborhood, which I grew up. And the elementary school was highly integrated with students from all over, whose parents came from all over the world. In fact, in May, we used to have a May Day procession at the high school, at grade school level, where youngsters would wear the native uh, gowns and other apparel from their parents' native country. And even in high school, I had classmates whose parents didn't speak any English. So the classmates would speak their native language at home and English in the community.
Do you feel like what you grew up in is what we're still striving for in a way?
Yes, we're still striving for that. And I was very fortunate to grow up in that kind of environment because what it conveyed to me was the humanity of people coming from all parts of the world, and it was a means of enhancing my own belief in myself. Uh, the schooling was good teachers, and at the high school level, to give you an example of how interested the staff was in all the students, uh, in many of the faculty knew that I was interested in science, even the librarian. So in 1944, I walked into the library, and Miss Nixon, the librarian, said, "Walter, I ordered a book which I think you should be interested in." The book was Rackham Holt's biography of George Washington Carver, 1943. I read that book, and there's one section I'll never forget. In 1853, George Washington Carver was sold for a racehorse in Diamond Grove, Missouri. I said to myself at that time, I said, if a person could undergo an experience like that and become one of the world's great agricultural technologists, then there are no problems for me. And so the household which nurtured me, my mother had 9 years of education. My father didn't have a day of education. They came north in 1921. My father to work in the coal mines and the steel mill. He worked 44 years of hard labor initially in the coal mine and then in the steel mill. It was Carnegie, Illinois Steel Corporation, which later became U.S. Steel. The community had a population of around 20 to 22,000. From my remembrance, there was no racial animosity or anything. And during the Depression years, of course, it was a very difficult time, and people didn't have time to be racist. They were more focused on survival. Within our household, I had 5 sisters and 1 brother. One sister, 3 years older than I, taught me how to read before I went to school. The school didn't teach me how to read. For about 4 years, my brother and I slept in the kitchen on a pull-out cot. My oldest sister, Irma, was very interested in just learning. My mother was an avid reader, so she served as a model for us. My oldest sister was a member of the Book of the Month Club in the late 30s, and I can still remember one title of a book she received. It was Vicky Baum's Shanghai 37. And the household we always had 1 or 2 daily newspapers, and we discussed community issues, national issues, and so forth. And all of us had a library card. The 7 children, it would take almost a near-death experience for you not to go to school. And your report card was carefully scrutinized, and you had a library card.
Some people might look at your story and say, this means that if you just work hard in America, you'll succeed. Nothing at the societal level necessarily has to change.
No, I think the problem is one of identity. If, as I grew older and became somewhat more literate in terms of my reading, and I focused on people like W.E.B. Du Bois. He was of personal interest to me because my grandfather's mentioned in that book. He, in his tour of the Black Belt in Daughtry County, Georgia. I think that reading the experiences of others was very important to me because what it conveyed to me was that sure, there are racial problems, but if you have a deep and abiding faith in your humanity and the creative talents that flow from that humanity, then you can achieve almost anything you want. I knew black physicians, dentists, lawyers, but I didn't know any scientists. So I took it as a challenge. And I believed that I could become a scientist. And that was my focus.
Yet you still pushed for societal change.
Oh yes, I encouraged people even at the high school level. I was president of the National Honor Society. In my high school class in 1946, I was salutatorian of a class of 317. There were 22 blacks in the class. 11 went on to college, and there was no money around. but people worked hard and felt that the future was in their hands and that they had to shape and formulate their own future.
But during the civil rights movement, you pushed for institutional change, right?
Right. Yes, I was very active in civil rights because I felt strongly that the barriers faced by African Americans, and I had faced them. For example, in 1950, when I graduated from Washington and Jefferson College, I was interviewed by DuPont, and whenever I showed up for the interview at our uh, interviewing office, uh, I recognized he was surprised to see that I was of color. So he went through a litany of explaining what outstanding record I had at the school. Member of the Chemistry Honorary Society, Chi Epsilon Mu, a officer of your class, a star football player, and just an overall good student at this institution. But then he replied, "Oh, but we do not hire black scientists in our research facility in Wilmington, Delaware." I looked him in the eye and I said, "You have a problem?" And I walked out. So, in spite of your qualifications, I knew that there were barriers based upon race. But what it taught me from my reading, I read lots of books also, lots of history. For example, in 1946, my high school, I did a lengthy paper on the Negro soldiers' contribution to American history. And the way I got the information, on Saturdays I would go to Pittsburgh to their huge Carnegie Library and search out anything and everything that I could find on African Americans, colored Americans, Negro Americans, racial problem, and so forth. And I did that because of my own interests, but the secondary aspect of it was that no person, I would not allow any person to come to me and give me a kind of softened history of blacks in the United States, especially in terms of the armed forces.
Do you think race relations now are better than they were when you were fighting for civil rights?
I think the record is somewhat spotty. I think that the civil rights movement excited lots of blacks, and it's certainly stimulated many of them to take advantage of new openings. But I think that there might have been a inflated estimate of what civil rights legislation could do for African Americans and Hispanics. I think it was the interpretation by many was inflated to the degree that disappointments would occur because of their expectations that everything was level and above board.
So you don't think we've reached?
No, we haven't reached a plateau as yet. And I had the being involved in civil rights was an excellent experience for me. And I became involved with the political institution because there were people who were involved in the system whom I thought would do much more in terms of leveling the playing field for minorities in this country. For example, in 1969, 1959. I sat on a committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt to try to get elected to a senator of the state of New York, Thomas K. Finletter, who had been Truman's air secretary. But we lost that when Keating became senator from New York State. But I maintained an interest in the political institution and was actively involved with a group at Bain Street Settlement Agency, and we chose Constance Mitchell to run for Third Ward supervisor in 1959. But the interesting aspect of that engagement was the participation by undergrads and graduate students from the University of Rochester. And there was a professor, Professor Richard Wade, history professor, who was actively involved with the Democratic County Committee, and he actually was able to inspire a number of students from the University of Rochester to participate in voter registration and other activities surrounding the political institution.
What recommendations would you give to those seeking to reach the plateau?
The recommendation would be knowing who you are in the United States. Over the years, I decided that, yes, I'm an American, yet on many occasions, I'm treated as the other. And those occasions are very critical to where I want to live, where I want to work, and how my skills would be acknowledged and rewarded in a profession. In a sense, it's almost like an equation where I recognize your citizenship is something like 1 minus X. X is the times you're treated as the other and not as a 100% American citizen. So you have that duality of interpreting your citizenship given the environment in which you function and try to and how to fulfill just under normal conditions being a citizen.
Spoken like a true scientist. How do we change that equation for people?
It's a very difficult equation to change because there are two factors. I think among minorities, the problem of identity has not been thoroughly researched, and how it impacts on how you function in a democratic society or as an American citizen. When you understand your identity, then I think you are propelled to be treated and to seek those avenues which will allow you to be treated as a full-fledged American citizen. And I think in terms of my own activities in a lifetime, it might have been something intrinsic to who I am. Always looked for the recognition of the humanity invested in others and the respect for my own humanity. And it would be the basis of very rich relationships. And that's the way I function. I don't expect white Americans often to respect my citizenship, but the important thing is that I respect it and that I do everything possible to have the fulfillment of that citizenship. That's the way I functioned, and I've had friendships for many years. I just recently talked to a friend whom we played football together at Washington and Jefferson College and graduated together in 1950. So to me, friendship is based upon the kind of mutual acceptance of the humanity invested in the individual.
Would I be mistaken to conclude that you're advocating change on a personal level and within the minority communities along with the institutional level?
I think that's a very good way to put it. I think within the minority community, we don't understand who we are within the total context of the American society. And I was able to derive that from reading extensively W.E.B. Du Bois when he said in his Souls of Black Folk, 1903, that it's like a veil that between us. We see you, but you don't see us. And so that mitigates against a one-to-one kind of relationship, because for some reasons you have to be truly seen as a citizen and as a human being.
What is the identity then? What would you advocate?
I think knowing who you are as an American, the limitations of who you are. And I think you can use that as the basis for being, living a full life and a creative life here in the United States. But I think from a historical perspective, I think you have to read the lives and understand things. For example, Du Bois saying, we see you, but you don't see us. To me, that led writers such as Ralph Ellison to write Invisible Man, and that's the basis. I think if you read some of our most outstanding writers, I think they have a grasp of their Americanism and the limitations thereof. And you read James Baldwin, for example, in his famous The Fire Next Time, 1992, one of the most poignant letters you ever want to read is his letter to his nephew James. And what he points out, he tells James, so your grandfather was a very holy man. Why was he very holy? Because he believed what the system said about him. And he was trying to convey to his nephew that you have the responsibility to identify yourself as a human being and the creative talents that can flow from that humanity. It's all in the literature. That's why I tell our historical past. That's why I tell youngsters at school, the book shall set ye free. It's not rap. I said, that's old stuff. If you knew a little history, you would know even in my generation, people rapped. But they didn't put it to music. For example, if you wanted to show how tough you were, you said, look, man, you don't want to mess with me because I was born during the Battle of Butcher Knives, reared and raised with 45s. Snakes were my playmates. Don't a dog say bow wow, don't a cat say meow, I'll do something about it. So what we are always, because of a lack of historical knowledge, we're always repeating the same old thing.
The answer is in the past then.
Oh yeah, you have to know where you came from.